In today's video, we are going to be discussing Chapter 11, Emotions, Aggression, and Stress. Our agenda for today, we are going to start with kind of laying the groundwork for what emotions are, some prominent theories of emotion, what do positive versus negative emotions look like, and we're going to look at polygraph tests and if those can really decipher if we're lying or are they just picking up some sort of emotional activation in our brain. How many emotions do we have? There's a few different theories about that. Facial expressions, the evolutionary viewpoint of emotions, a very, very brief slide about development of how we develop emotions, more so what emotions do we see that are present at birth. You can go through an entire lecture of just talking about how we develop emotions throughout the trajectory of our life, so it's very brief in this lecture. Discussing brain circuits, how fear conditioning works, and then we are going to discuss aggression, stress, the stress response. We are going to end the lecture by talking about combating stress, and then I also have a really interesting TED Talk at the end of this lecture that I found that talks about some really interesting emerging research about how to treat depression, and it's very much related to the content of this chapter. So first, what are emotions? So emotions are observable behaviors, expressed feelings, and physiological changes in the body. So these three components. There are also four key aspects to what an emotion is. They are feelings, they are actions, they have physiological arousal components, and they have a motivation aspect to them. So those four different aspects, we are going to talk about each of those one by one. First one, feelings. So feelings are often private and they are very subjective. They are a huge range of different states. Actions, when we mean actions, we're talking about emotional actions. Some examples of this would be defending yourself or attacking in response to a threat. That is an emotional action. The third one, physiological arousal. These are distinct somatic and autonomic responses that we have in the body that occur when we are experiencing an emotion. Emotions are defined by a specific cluster of responses of somatic and both autonomic responses, and we can measure these in both humans and non-human animals. So we can kind of look at the pattern of what certain emotions look like in the body. And then the fourth aspect to emotions is motivation. These are coordinated responses to solve adaptive problems. So this is the motivation to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and that is definitely very much implicated in emotional processing. There are four different theories of emotion that we are going to discuss for this class. The first one is folk psychology. The second is James Lange theory. The third is Cannon-Bard. And the fourth is Schachter's cognitive theory. Now, sometimes some other books go into even more detail. There has been a few other theories of emotion, but for the purpose of this class, we're just going to cover these four. You might have already covered these in your Psych 100 class. I definitely covered these in my Psych 100 class, so these could be review for you if you have taken Psych 100. So, first one, folk psychology. So, folk psychology posits that emotions cause a bodily reaction, and they also are going to cause autonomic reactions. So it's this kind of body response, it's this autonomic kind of inner pattern of response that we have, and So the whole idea with folk psychology is that we would experience some sort of stimulus. We would perceive it, interpret it, we would feel that emotion, and then there would be a specific pattern of autonomic arousal. So the example I have up here is that it says that you are going to feel anger, and then that is going to cause your stomach to churn. So folk psychology says that we feel the emotion first, and then our body kind of reacts. James Lange theory says that our body response actually causes our emotional feeling. So instead, we had folk psychology saying that we feel the emotion first and then have the bodily response. This is kind of opposite. So, for example, your stomach churns, you perceive it as anger. So we have the bodily response first and then kind of a perception of what we're feeling. So down here we have a stimulus, say we hear some sort of loud bang noise, maybe like a popping noise, and we're like, oh, is that a firework? Is that a, is that a gun maybe? What is this like loud banging noise? You're not quite sure. So you perceive and interpret this. You're going to have a specific pattern of arousal. So maybe your heart's going to go up. You're going to start sweating. Your palms will start sweating. And then you are going to experience the emotion. So this says we have autonomic first, and then we have the emotion second. What are some problems with this? So we do not have a distinct autonomic pattern for each different emotion that we experience. We're going to talk later about how you can definitely look in the body and be able to tell whether someone is experiencing a positive versus a negative emotion, but we do not have a very, very specific autonomic pattern for every emotion that we could possibly be feeling. So that is a really big problem with this theory of trying to describe how we experience emotions. The next one is Cannon-Bard. And Cannon-Bard says that our brain is going to interpret and then decide which emotion is appropriate. So we have the response and emotion simultaneously. Rather than one coming right after the other, we have them happening at the same time. It is going to have our body respond to the emotion and either activate our parasympathetic nervous system for rest or our sympathetic nervous system for action. So again, we're hearing that really loud noise. It's coming into our senses. We're perceiving and interpreting it. If we think that it's something dangerous, we are going to have general autonomic arousal. So again, like that increased heart rate, that increased blood pressure, and we are going to experience the emotion at the same time. So Cannon-Bard, everything is happening simultaneously. Folk psychology says that we are going to experience the emotion and then we're going to experience the bodily processes. Whereas James Lange says it's opposite. It says we're going to have bodily processes and then experience the emotion. Cannon-Bard says that everything is happening simultaneously. So the fourth one is Schachter's cognitive theory. And Schachter really wanted to focus on how cognitive mechanisms can come into play when we are trying to figure out what emotion that we should be feeling. And that's just it, right? He posits that people have this sort of appraisal or interpretation and then kind of unconsciously decide what feeling to consciously experience. So in Schachter's cognitive theory, it posits that the brain interprets responses relative to environmental cues. So this could be things like we look at the eliciting stimuli, we look at the surrounding situation, we kind of assess what cognitive state that we're already in prior to this experience. We look at our prior experiences based off of whatever we are encountering, so that before you kind of unconsciously decide. Your body kind of runs through all of these things. Like, okay, have I been in this situation before? Was it threatening when I was in it then? What has been my overall experience with this object or this situation before? What kind of just state am I currently in? And that is going to help you kind of quote unquote decide what you're going to feel. So I have this little example down here. So you have a like growling, really aggressive dog, and that's could be very kind of scary. So you have an autonomic arousal, you get kind of scared, frightened, and then there is this appraisal piece. So this is what is the most important thing with Schachter's cognitive theory, is that you are going to, after you kind of experience this heightened state of autonomic arousal, you kind of take a minute unconsciously and be like, okay, wait a second. Like, is this something that I need to be scared of? Is it not? And then you either feel fear, for example, or you don't. So in this one, it says, I label my trembling as fear because I appraise the situation as dangerous. So it's because this situation is being appraised as being dangerous, that is why we get the conscious feeling of fear. So Schachter is all about us making a decision, a mental decision in our mind about whether we have something to be scared of or not. Do we have a reason to feel a certain emotion, or are we totally okay and fine? So, also what Schachter says is that emotional labels depend on our interpretation, which we kind of just discussed. However, physiological arousal, it argues that physiological arousal is nonspecific. That's kind of what Schachter is saying, but is this actually true? Is our physiological arousal the same for positive versus negative emotions? And that is not true. So, patterns of autonomic responses depend on whether the emotion is positive or negative. So, I said earlier how we don't have a specific pattern of arousal for every single emotion that we experience. It's not like, for instance, joy looks super different than happiness. Those are kind of different levels of a similar emotion. Or it's not like sadness looks different than like melancholy or something like that, just getting really nitty-gritty specific. However, what we do find is that positive emotions look similar to other positive emotions, and negative emotions look similar to other negative emotions. However, positive and negative emotions look very different from one another. So you can decipher a positive versus a negative emotion, but it's kind of difficult to be able to decipher one positive emotion from another positive emotion, or one negative emotion from another negative emotion. However, you can decipher a positive from a negative. Hopefully I didn't say the words positive and negative too much and confuse you, but you hopefully get the gist of what we're talking about here. So we can decipher broadly between what is a positive versus a negative emotion when we look at physiological responses. So how does this play into life situations? This idea of deciphering emotions physiologically in the body. We're going to talk about the example of a polygraph test. So for those of you who don't know what a polygraph test is, maybe you're more familiar with the term lie detector. And what lie detectors do is they measure heart rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response. Galvanic skin response, you can see these little like finger pads that are hooked up to this electrode right here. That is kind of a way to measure how much someone is sweating. And usually we associate that with somebody feeling nervous. People tend to sweat more when they feel more nervous or on edge about things. And proponents say that polygraph tests are 95% accurate. However, we find that in research, polygraph tests are only 65% accurate. So they are not particularly good or actually very accurate. 65% is not a very good rate, especially when we're talking about using these in court and trying to add them to a body of evidence to convict someone. Why are we using these things that are actually not empirically based as being good tools? So we talked about how negative emotions look similar to other negative emotions. All negative emotions have pretty much the same physiological pattern. So when we're talking about administering people to a polygraph test, are these polygraphs simply recording negative emotions rather than recording a lie? That is a very controversial thing with these tests. So what are we actually measuring when we use these? So next time somebody you hear about a lie detector being used in maybe some sort of case, you can fact check people with telling them how polygraph tests are actually not backed by research. They could just be recording negative emotions rather than be able to tell us if someone is lying. So yeah, little tidbit of information for you guys. I thought that would be interesting. There is a section about this in your book in this chapter if you would like to read more about this. So moving on, how many emotions do we have or can we experience? Are we capable of? And there's a couple of researchers that are really interested in looking at how many emotions that we are able to experience. So we have Plutchik in 1994, and he said that we basically have 8 basic emotions. They are 4 pairs of emotions of opposites, and I'll show you guys a picture on the next page so you can see. It's the same one from your book. So 8 basic emotions, 4 pairs of opposites, and that emotions are based off of levels of intensity. So we can get different emotions depending on what level of intensity we go at from that basic emotion. So example, joy is one of the emotions that Plutchik argues we are capable of. The low intensity, this should actually be happiness. I'm going to fix this for you guys. Literally in the middle here. So this low should be happiness, and this medium is joy, and this high is ecstasy. Okay. So, example. Joy. Joy is the basic emotion. So the lower intensity of joy would be happiness. The medium intensity is joy. So these 8 basic emotions are always going to be at their like kind of mid-level. And if you go really high intensity, he argues that that would be something like feeling ecstasy. So let's look at this in a picture format. So we have low, medium, and high. So here we have something like affection. So we have high level would be adoration, low level would be regard. We have sadness. So we have the low level is pensiveness. The medium is sadness, and the highest level would be grief. Or even distraction. So surprise is our little basic in the middle. A low level of that would just be distraction, and a high level would be amazement. So we have joy and sadness, affection, disgust, anger and fear, expectation and surprise. Whoops. So as you can see, these are in opposites. So affection is the opposite of disgust. Expectation is the opposite of surprise. So you can see how these are paired. Another researcher, Elkman, wanted to do a study about how many emotions that we have. And he says that different emotions can be detected in facial expressions. and that these expressions are going to be similar cross-culturally. So they are similar in production, however, they are going to be different in display. So there are going to be appropriate times and not appropriate times in different cultures to display certain emotions. So that's what I mean about them being different in display. So as you can see on here, he argues that we have these 8 facial expressions that are cross-culturally universal, and he has mapped them onto anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, surprise, contempt, and embarrassment. So that these are emotions that we can find consistently in every single culture. And these facial expressions, you could take someone from one culture, they could see the face from someone of another culture, and be able to identify, okay, yes, that is sadness, that's fear, that's surprise, and so forth. So how do we even make facial expressions? We have to talk about some facial nerves. I know that you guys loved learning about those facial nerves and memorizing them. So facial muscles are innervated by the facial nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 7. This helps with your superficial muscles. The right and the left superficial muscles are going to be independent. And then you also have the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5. These are for deep facial muscles. So as you can see right on here, we have the facial nerve. It's going to innervate your superficial muscles that are going to help you make different expressions. And then your deep facial muscles, like those controlling the jaw, are with the trigeminal, but you can't see the trigeminal in this particular picture. We have 2 categories of facial muscles. We kind of talked about them on the last slide. So we have superficial muscles. These are muscles that are attached to your skin. So they are more towards the surface, so they are superficial. So they attach to the skin. They are particularly responsible for helping change the shape of your mouth, your eyes, and your nose. Then we also have deep facial muscles. These are attached to your skeleton, so they're just like the name suggests, they are deeper within our bodies, so they attach to the skeleton, and they enable movements such as chewing. So a lot of our expressiveness definitely comes from our superficial muscles. They help us wrinkle our forehead, raise our eyebrows, smile, everything like that. So speaking of facial expressions, there is this facial feedback hypothesis that suggests that just by having facial feedback, you will experience an emotion. So for example, if you smile, if you can get yourself to smile, facial feedback hypothesis says that you are going to feel happiness or feel some sort of like joy or positive emotion. Now it does depend on how genuine that the smile is. So this is kind of like another level of detail that is not included in this chapter, but we call a genuine smile that kind of engages these zygomatic muscles in your face, kind of wrinkles your eyes. I'm doing it right now. That's why my voice changed. Brings your mouth up. A true smile is called a Duchenne smile. So if you just have somebody smile and it's kind of like a kind of half effort smile, that's not going to be as effective as getting someone into like a full genuine smile. So down here, I was actually a part of a research study where we did this. We had people do this and hold a chopstick in their mouth and push it far back, make them smile, and then they had to fill out all of these questions. And we were trying to get them into a genuine smile, because that was important for our experiment. But nonetheless, that was a total tangent. Facial feedback hypothesis is true in some cases. So we do see in research, this is on page 328 in your book, we do see in research that we have been able to have people report more positive feelings when they're simulating a smile rather than when they're simulating a frown. However, if you really have to force someone into doing it, that is not going to work. Or people who say, oh, like just put on a happy face, might not be the best advice because it has to be really convincing. You can't just, if you're like really forced into it, or if you're like doing it kind of like half effort, it's not going to work as well as if like you're doing it like this girl right down here, and if you're not forcing someone into doing it. So facial feedback hypothesis is definitely true, but there are a few like caveats in it. It says in your book how being forced to display false emotional expressions in stressful situations may actually cause negative consequences for your well-being. So if someone's in a kind of really stressful situation or going through a lot and you're like, oh, just like smile, it'll like boost your mood, that actually might not be the best advice. So yes, facial feedback hypothesis can be helpful, but there's going to be situations where it is more helpful than not. So we already talked about this. Is this true? Yes, kind of, but we discussed ways in which it might not be true. So forcing someone into an expression, there are certain times where it's not going to be as effective as others, like if someone's in the middle of like a crisis or just something really stressful. So there are impairments facially that people can have that are going to limit their social interactions and limit their just kind of emotional connection with other people. So what about individuals who have trouble with facial expressions? How does that affect their relationships with people or how they come across? There are certain disorders that are associated with the inhibition of facial muscles, like Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, and Bell's palsy. So these can be really difficult for individuals because they can really limit their emotional connection with other people. Bell's palsy is a disorder in which kind of like half the face is more or less frozen. Schizophrenia, we're going to talk about schizophrenia in our next chapter. You can have a lot of different kind of outward behavior expressions when you have schizophrenia. You can have somebody who has catatonic schizophrenia, so they're very, very frozen. People with schizophrenia can kind of have like tics. And then Parkinson's disease is when you are like uncontrollably shaking. So it can be really difficult for these people in expressing emotions to others, emotionally bonding with other people. So making facial expressions with others is very, very important for humans to connect with other humans. So what is the purpose of us even having emotions in the first place? Evolutionary psychology focuses on how natural selection has shaped our behavior. So survival of the fittest. Only the strongest traits and the ones that are the most suited for our survival are going to continue to get passed on. But how does this relate to emotions? You think about evolution with like, okay, you know, the way that maybe like our fingers work, the way that we're able to pick things up, the way that we walk. But those are things that are adaptive and for our survival. But why would emotions be something that would be adaptive for us? So emotions can help us solve adaptive problems. They can help us cooperate with a group. They can assist us with choosing a mate, bonding with a mate, and also avoiding predators or giving off signals to others like don't come near me. Those are all different ways in which emotions can actually be adaptive for us. There's some big names in evolutionary research. I'm sure you've all heard, of course, of Charles Darwin. So he wrote a piece called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, which is super interesting and very related to what we are discussing. So what he found in his field research is that there are universal expressions and emotions among people, and that animals also have comparable emotions to what he observed in his field work with human beings. So he argued that we have a common ancestor. If we are both kind of able to see these similarities in both of these species, in non-human animals and humans, could it be that we all came from a common ancestor? So then we had Redican, who was another researcher, come along in 1982. And what he did is he described primate and human expressions and how those primate expressions are relative to humans. So he observed a grimace in primates, and he said that this looked like fear or surprise in humans. A tense mouth observed in primates is like anger in humans. A play face in primates is very much like the human laugh. So really interesting how we can look at humans and non-human animals and see the similarities. I think we can maybe tend to think that we have like much higher level emotional feelings, and that might be true. We might have higher level emotional processing, but it is very much found in research that animals absolutely experience emotions. They use emotions to survive. They use emotions to bond with members of their species, even bond with humans. I'm sure those of you who have animals at home would absolutely argue that animals are capable of emotional processing. So some other kind of observations that were looked at, female chimps screaming at each other over food. This kind of showed submission and protest. Juvenile chimps that were tickled were also observed to laugh or produce this kind of sound that was like laughter in humans. Macaques, those are a type of primate. When they bared their teeth in like this kind of like grinning stance to a more dominant macaque, that was to assert their own dominance. So showing their teeth was a way of showing dominance. So some of these are similar to humans. I don't know if I've ever seen people show their teeth at one another to show dominance, but definitely with the laughter and joy, being tickled, and female chimps screaming at each other. That definitely reminds me of Real Housewives for any of you who watch Bravo. It's very, very similar. Okay, so very briefly, we're going to talk about the development of emotions. Really, I'm just going to briefly go over what emotions are present at birth. So we have seen, I have these cute pictures of these babies. We have seen that some emotions that are present are interest, enjoyment, surprise, distress, anger, fear, and disgust. Pretty sure. Oh, and dissmell. So dissmell is like it is related to disgust, but it's particular to odors. So it's smelling something and kind of like leaning away from it, scrunching their face. There are a lot of different studies about this. There's some people who argue that there are more. Some people argue that there are less. They group certain ones of them together. You could go into an entire lecture, like I was saying, about emotions and how emotions develop. but that is definitely more geared towards a developmental class rather than biopsych. But I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the emotions that we kind of see are present at birth. Okay, moving on to brain circuits. This is why we're here. This is why we're taking biopsych. What do these emotions look like in our brain? Where do they go? Where do they send to? What is released in our brain when we are experiencing certain emotions? So, to just kind of lay some groundwork for talking about brain circuits, animals and humans, we have seen in studies, will work to provide electrical stimulation to the brain. So we call this brain self-stimulation. There is a very famous study done by these researchers named Olds and Milner in 1954, and they saw that rats would tap with their little paw, press on a lever to stimulate the septum, which is right here. And as you can see, there's this structure called the nucleus accumbens, which we're going to talk about later. That is definitely very important. And the medial forebrain bundle, VTA is important. These things, nucleus accumbens and medial forebrain bundle, we're going to discuss in the next slide or two. But this suggested, when we saw these rats press the lever to stimulate this area called the septum, this suggests that maybe the septum is a pleasure or reward center in the brain. Maybe very positive feelings when that area is stimulated or more active. We have found that areas in the brain that handle emotional processing are mostly subcortical. So when I say subcortical, I just mean that they're buried deep under the cortex. So the cortex is that kind of outer shell of the brain. However, we find that brain circuits are subcortical, so they're like really kind of deep inside in the center of our brains and the brains of animals. We have the medial forebrain bundle, which, as you saw on that little picture of the rat brain, this is a tract that travels in the midbrain to the hypothalamus, and it is going to hit the nucleus accumbens on its way. And the nucleus accumbens is known as being the reward center of our brain. It is very, very concentrated with dopamine. It is one of the dopamine pathways in our brain. We talked about those briefly when we were discussing drugs, the two different kind of dopamine pathways. So the nucleus accumbens is very much concentrated in dopamine. It is a part of the dopamine pathway. This is an area that is very typically lit up when people use drugs, and it is thought to be one of the reasons why drugs can be so addicting and why people can develop addictions to drugs is because many of them are going to stimulate that nucleus accumbens area. We also have the limbic system, which is a group of nuclei that are in charge of emotional processing. We've talked about this before, so this is on page 329 in your book. I don't need you guys to necessarily know every single structure that's in the limbic system, but know that it is particularly responsible for emotional processing. We also have, which is not covered in your book, the Papez circuit, and this is within your limbic system. And this handles the emotional aspects of your memory. It starts and it ends in the hippocampus, and we know that the hippocampus is very much responsible for helping us with memory-related processing. So it makes sense that this circuit, it's going through the limbic system, which is our emotional processing station, and it starts and ends in the hippocampus. So it's to no surprise that it handles emotional aspects of memory. So when you can kind of think back at a fond memory that maybe made you really happy. Maybe there's certain holiday memories. Those I know are big for a lot of people because they're usually associated with traditions and family and being with people that you love. But when you can kind of go back and remember those feelings that you had, your Papez circuit is very much responsible for helping you kind of tap into those emotional aspects of that memory, maybe of that Christmas, that Hanukkah, that 4th of July, that Ramadan, that time you had with your family. It would be your Papez circuit. Equally, again, for memories that maybe are not so great, not so happy. Maybe the death of a loved one, of a family member. Being able to go back and revisit those feelings that you had and how that instance made you feel, how that time in your life made you feel. Your Papez circuit is responsible for that. If we have someone who has damage to their Papez circuit, we often see that is associated with that person having either Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, or Korsakoff syndrome. And recall that Korsakoff syndrome is basically like alcohol-induced Alzheimer's. So these are memory-related disorders. Parkinson's, not so much. But Alzheimer's and Korsakoff's are definitely memory-related issues. People forget maybe who they themselves are. They forget who their family is. They don't really remember a whole lot about themselves. That, like emotional connection with people might be lost. And you have heard those studies about it. People having those days where they're totally fine or they do remember, they can make their emotional connections, but it usually is followed with them not being able to. So damage to the Papez circuit is associated with those disorders. So what is the evidence for subcortical emotional processing? So we've said emotions are processed subcortical, but what is that? How do we know that? What research have we done to kind of determine that emotional processing is definitely subcortical? We can look at studies with decorticate rage. This is cortex removal in dogs. They did studies on this. And it was characterized by sudden, intense rage. So what happened with these dogs is that they had sudden, intense rage with their cortex removed, and they displayed that the cortex possibly is in charge of inhibiting rage. So the fact that we still had these subcortical structures and these dogs had this very strong rage reaction suggests that there is subcortical emotional processing. So maybe the cortex, yes, does help with inhibiting certain emotional processes, but the heart of where those emotions come from is subcortical. So the fact that these dogs still had these subcortical structures and they showed these really high-level, intense, raging behaviors suggests definitely that things like anger are for sure coming from areas that are subcortical. The next evidence is Kluver-Bucy syndrome. This has to do with monkeys. There was a study that was done where these monkeys had their temporal lobes removed. So the temporal lobe is on your sides of your brain. And the amygdala is in your temporal lobe. So your amygdala can be found on both sides of your brain. The same in monkeys. So if you remove the temporal lobe, it removes both the left and the right amygdala. And what we saw in these monkeys is that there was a taming effect. When they saw a snake, they didn't freak out. They would show them, as you can see in that picture, they showed them a real live snake. And normally what they would do is completely freak out because that is, signals danger. And when they had their amygdalas removed, they did not have that experience. They just kind of looked at it like it was nothing and had no reaction to it. So this suggests to us for sure, which leads into this, that studies suggest for sure that the amygdala is very important for emotional processing. So the amygdala is within the limbic system. This is a very rudimentary drawing of it, but sometimes simple pictures are better. So the amygdala is within the limbic system. It's found within your temporal lobe. You have one part of the amygdala is going to be on the left, part's on the right. It's like a direct mirror on both sides of your brain. And it is a key structure in the mediation of fear. So as you saw in Kluver-Bucy syndrome, it is very important for experiencing fear. It's definitely also important for experiencing anger, but we're particularly going to talk about fear. It really helps us with emotional learning, helping us to make connections with what is scary, what's safe, what should we be afraid of, what should we not be afraid of. So that's kind of what I mean with emotional learning. So classical conditioning, if any of you, again, this is throwback to Psych 100, something like classical conditioning can elicit fear, and this is going to tie into the amygdala. Let's just wait a second and review what classical conditioning is. So we can take something neutral like the sound, a sound, say maybe it's even like a sound like on your phone. It's like one of the many text message noises that you can choose from on your phone. That's something that's pretty neutral. That is not going to elicit major sadness in someone or major happiness. I mean, it depends on if you're expecting a text from someone. But in general, if you just gave those noises to people, they wouldn't necessarily elicit these really big, on average, these big happy or sad or type of emotional responses. They're neutral. But if you pair a tone like that with an aversive stimulus, like a shock, so if you pair a little ringtone sound or just any kind of neutral kind of tone noise, the same time as when you shock someone, what will happen is if you repeatedly do that, that person or that animal, that thing is going to start to associate just that noise with fear. So it'll get to the point where you can literally just make that sound. You won't even have to do the shock. And whatever you have conditioned with that shock and that tone is going to freak out. So if somebody did that to me and it was a dinging noise on my phone and they shocked me every single time, I could be walking around and I could hear somebody say somebody has that text message noise on their phone. I'll hear that noise and I'll immediately have this big reaction. My autonomic response will go up, my heart rate will increase, I'll maybe start sweating. I will start to feel fear emotionally and physiologically. So how does this play into the amygdala? We talked about how the amygdala is really important for helping us with emotional processing and mediating our feelings of fear. Amygdala is very important in fear conditioning. So, for example, researchers lesioned the central nucleus of the amygdala. So this is just a specific part of the amygdala. They lesioned the central nucleus of the amygdala in rats, and they saw that these rats did not produce any fear conditioning behavior at all. So they had done some fear conditioning with them, so they were producing a certain response to something that they had been conditioned to. Then they lesioned the central nucleus in them, and they did not produce the response anymore. So clearly the amygdala is very important for us experiencing fear, knowing to identify something that is fear-provoking. So if we know that the amygdala is really important and these other subcortical structures, how is fear even processed? We have two different ways that we can process fear and experience fear. There is a low road processing. This is very unconscious, fast processing that we have. So for example, we see a scorpion, we experience immediate fear. This is very based in evolutionary psychology. There's just certain objects that we see that we know to immediately be scared of. So like predators, definitely like a scorpion, any sort of like spider usually people are afraid of, especially if it's like a huge spider, maybe like a tarantula, a like bear that's coming at you. Those are all things that are, you see them and you're going to automatically probably be scared, experience some level of fear. So low road, you don't even have to like recognize like, oh, that's a bear, I should be scared, or oh, that's a scorpion, I should be scared. It's this automatic, very quick, unconscious response. So that is the low road processing. We also have high road processing. That is kind of more conscious. It is slower processing. It's still happening very, very quickly. Because, at any time we are perceiving something, it's happening rather quickly. You're not really sitting there for like, a few minutes being like, should I be afraid of this? Should I not be? So it's still happening pretty quickly, but it's slower than low road. So for example, if you're like on a trail and you see a slim, long figure on the ground, you might be like, oh, is that a snake or is that a stick? Like if you're not totally sure what something is, you're kind of trying to decide, okay, do I need to be afraid? Do I not need to be afraid? What is this thing that I'm seeing? And there is a difference in these pathways in how they are processed in our brain. So this graphic from your book is really, really good. It's pretty simple, which is why I like it. So with low road processing, so this is much quicker. This has stimuli coming in to the sensory organs. So usually like you're visually seeing something, you might be touching it, some sort of sensory organ is going to take in this information. Then it is going to project to your thalamus. It is going to directly, low road goes directly to your amygdala. So see how high road has to go through all these other processes first? Low road goes directly to your amygdala, to the lateral nucleus, then to the central nucleus. And then that is going to produce emotional behavior. So are you going to, fight or flight? Are you going to run away? Are you going to approach? Autonomic responses, hormonal responses, things being released in your body. So that is low road processing. So as you can see, after it goes to the thalamus, it's going directly to the amygdala. Whereas in high road processing, it has one more step than low road processing. So I have it highlighted here. So goes through the sensory organ, projects to the thalamus. High road processing gets projected to the sensory cortex and to the hippocampus before it gets relayed to the amygdala. And then all this rest process is all the same. So there's an extra step, and this extra step kind of helps with a little more cognitive appraisal of situations, a little more interpretation in our brains. We're trying to figure out, okay, is this something I need to be afraid of? Is it not? So those are biologically how high road and low road processing look differently in the brain. And we have done studies on this in laboratory settings. Pretty sure definitely with rat and mice models, and I'm fairly certain that we've done this with humans as well, to be able to see. Maybe we like show people, you can do this by showing people pictures of things or actually showing them live objects, and seeing if there is high road processing or low road processing taking place to elicit that fear. So moving on to aggression. We've covered fear and fear conditioning. What about aggression? Aggression can be related to fear. So aggression is an inner feeling of hate and a desire to harm. There is a really big sex difference in aggression. We see that in many species, males tend to be more aggressive. This is largely due to their need to access food, access mates. There is different evidence about testosterone and aggression. So we're going to talk about how testosterone and aggression looks different in non-human animals versus animals. So again, right here, we definitely see how testosterone is related to aggression in animals, but is testosterone related to aggression in humans? There is some kind of conflicting evidence here. So, testosterone and aggression in animals. We're actually going to just go back up here. So, testosterone and aggression in animals, it makes sense that animals would have to be aggressive, especially males would have to be aggressive, like I was saying, for the purposes of gaining food, accessing mates. Those are very adaptive behaviors. And what we see in animals is that if we eliminate testosterone, such as castrating an animal, that is associated with a decrease in aggression. So testosterone is definitely a big factor in seeing aggressive behaviors in animals. If we have testosterone present again, or we re-implant the testes, we see aggression. So you guys probably remember this from the Berthold experiment with the chicken or with the roosters, how re-implanting the testes, we were able to see that the roosters showed mounting behaviors. They were more likely to kind of like combat with other roosters over mates. So same thing here. Animals who lost testosterone by being castrated, they're not showing those aggressive behaviors, but then when you get the presence of testosterone again, you see that return of aggression. There's a couple of confounding variables to consider, though, when we're looking at this research with testosterone and aggression. So there is the variable of experience. We call this, I termed this myself, kind of the losers versus winners experience. So in the animal world, especially in, for example, like mice and monkeys, the loser in aggressive encounters, such as like fighting each other over food or fighting for each other over a mate, access to a mate, the loser is always associated with having lower levels of androgens, and testosterone is an androgen. Whereas the winners of these experiences are associated with having higher levels of androgen, so higher levels of testosterone. So if you are a member of a species that is like kind of constantly losing these aggressive battles, you're just naturally going to have lower levels of testosterone. So this also plays into dominance factors too. Experience is kind of woven in with dominance. So according to kind of this model, if we're saying that, testosterone is definitely related to aggression, then testosterone levels should be associated with behaviors that protect the individual's social status. So then we're just going to see that naturally, more dominant members of the species are going to have higher levels of testosterone. So when we look at this research about the interplay of testosterone and aggression, we really have to make sure that we are considering these other kind of environmental or experience related or social status related factors that can play into this relationship between testosterone and aggression. In general, we definitely do see that it's more related in animals, even if you do kind of factor in these variables. However, what about with humans? Humans, the relationship between testosterone and aggression is very complicated. We have some studies where we see, yes, it's definitely related. We have other studies where it's like, no, we're not finding that. So the jury's kind of more or less out on whether this is like always as true for humans as it is for animals. With animals, we see more consistent research, more consistent findings that testosterone and aggression are very much related. So one kind of piece of evidence to consider when we're assessing testosterone and aggression in humans is that we do not see an increase in aggression at puberty. Especially male boys are going to experience kind of a surge of testosterone at puberty, but that does not come along with a surge of aggressive behaviors. So if higher levels of testosterone or testosterone itself was always going to be interconnected with aggression, then we would expect to see, if these boys are experiencing this kind of like surge in androgens at puberty, that we would see more aggression, but we don't. In some studies, we do see that increases in testosterone is relatively positively correlated with an increase in hostility or hostile behaviors. We see that women who are convicted of unprovoked violence, so women who were violent, who did not have someone like come at them first, they were totally unprovoked, they just act violently towards another person or towards another thing. So women convicted of committing this kind of unprovoked violence, we saw that they had higher levels of testosterone. So as you can see, we definitely do find research that suggests that it is related, but it's not completely clear on whether it absolutely all the time is, or whether there's maybe certain circumstances. There could be other biological factors that play into this as well. We talked about testosterone and aggression and how testosterone might be related to increases in aggression, but what about serotonin and aggression? We see that there is a negative correlation with serotonin and aggression. So with testosterone and aggression, that is a positive correlation. And remember, correlation does not equal causation. We're just saying that the two are related to each other. But serotonin has a negative correlation. So that means that an increase in serotonin is related to a decrease or lower levels of aggression, and the opposite as well. So lower levels of serotonin we have seen are related to an increase in aggression. So what's the evidence for this? We have seen in studies with monkeys that monkeys who have higher levels of serotonin are associated with having lower levels of aggression. In studies with mice, we see that mice who do not have serotonin receptors, so they are not able to receive serotonin so it can be used in their body, are associated with showing higher levels of aggression. What about in humans? We see that lower levels of serotonin are found in humans who have experienced alcohol-induced violence or excessive military violence. And again, a lot of these are more correlational studies, so they're not causation, but there could be like other factors to consider in this research, but we definitely do see that there is a relationship between these neurotransmitters, these hormones, these androgens, with aggression. What exactly is the reason why they are related? Not as clear, but we just know that serotonin is generally related with lower levels of aggression, and testosterone is generally related with higher levels of aggression. Of course, there are going to be exceptions to this research. Speaking of aggression, we have something called dyscontrol syndrome. This is a temporal lobe disorder. This underlies some human violence. And I don't know if you recognize the guy who is on the left of your screen, but speaking of psychopaths, this is Ted Bundy. Psychopaths are people who are incapable of feeling remorse, and they may commit very, very violent acts and extreme acts of aggression. So, for example, again, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy killed, they honestly don't even know. It could be that he killed like hundreds and hundreds of women. There could be women were primarily his target. I watched the Netflix special on Ted Bundy, the Ted Bundy tapes. Which is really, really interesting. A reporter, or I don't think it was a reporter, I think it was somebody from the police force. They were trying to get him to talk about his murders, and he kept denying it. So what the interrogator did was they started to say, okay, well, if someone did this, then how would they do it? And then he found that Ted Bundy just like went on a rampage about talking about all of the things that he did inadvertently by just saying like, oh, well, you know, that guy would have done this and he would have done that. And he was essentially convicting himself of all of these murders. So they have these recordings and they turned it into a Netflix special, and it's extremely interesting. And they actually really wanted to use Ted Bundy for research, and there was a petition to get him pulled off of death row so that we could study him. And from a research perspective, I really think that this could have been very interesting for us to look at the brain chemistry of someone who was a massive psychopath. Didn't have these feelings of remorse, just killed people and just went on with his like daily life. He was like studying to be a lawyer. He looked like just like your average person, or in that movie Psycho. It's very interesting to contribute to like the body of scientific knowledge to study these people and see what's different about their brains. Unfortunately, Ted Bundy was killed before we could do that. I'm definitely not saying that it's maybe not the worst thing in the world that someone who committed so much violence is no longer with us and able to harm others. However, I do think that these are really, really great opportunities for the body of knowledge for science. So that was my tangent about Ted Bundy. You should watch the Ted Bundy tapes on Netflix if you get the chance, if you have access to Netflix. And there's a bunch of other stuff about him online. I'm sure other maybe free specials you can find on YouTube and things like that. So the last part of our lecture, we're going to talk about stress. So this is very, very, I'm sure, common for all of you in being college students. It is still common for me just as an adult, as a graduate student, which I technically still am. My thesis is the bane of my existence. So stress, all of us feel it, all of us experience it. Maybe we're stressed right now, we're in a stressful situation, so this is kind of very timely. So what is stress? Technically, stress is any circumstance that upsets homeostasis. Absolutely anything. It doesn't have to be something that is bad. So the good thing about stress, there is a good about stress. We need stress. We need a certain level of stress to be able to do certain things in our lives. So stress is key for our survival. It helps us meet daily challenges. It helps us accomplish tasks. So as you can see on this little kind of chart that I have over here, we have performance, low to high over here. We have stress, low to high over here. So if our stress levels are way too low, then we're going to be lazy and we're maybe going to be fatigued. Sleep. So when you're sleeping, your levels of stress are pretty low. They're pretty non-existent. However, high levels of stress can cause you to have impaired sleep, but that's a whole other thing. So, but you are going to be, you're like bored basically if you have really, really low levels of stress. Then as you kind of go up, a certain level of stress is needed for us to just pay attention and be alert to things. There's this optimal point of stress, this kind of medium level of stress where we're like performing, we're carrying out tasks. It's great. We're able to meet our daily challenges, carry out a whole day, getting things done, working, managing different things in our lives. Then as you increase in stress on the high end, that is when you start to see another decrease in performance. So we have this optimal level of stress that we need to, again, like I said, meet daily challenges, accomplish things. But if our stress gets too high, that is when we get into states of anxiety and disorganization, depression, a lot of bad things, like when you talk about stress, like the negative things that you hear about stress. So speaking of which, the bad that stress can do to you, it can cause you to have a weakened immune system. It can cause higher blood pressure, definitely depression. It aids in the buildup of plaque in your arteries, which is related to heart disease and people experiencing heart attacks. Issues with sleep is a big one for people who experience stress. Anxiety is not on here. I could write a whole paper on the negative effects of stress. And when we talk about the negative effects of stress, we're talking about either really high levels of stress, or more so what a lot of these are related to is even like a not like super crazy high level, but maybe in between a medium and a high level of stress for a really prolonged period of time. That is very, very key. Having little spikes of stress here and there is not necessarily bad for you. It's good for your body to kind of like ebb and flow in that way. But when you are stressed for really, really long periods of time, that is what is really going to deplete the resources in your body and start to weaken your immune system, make you or contribute to feelings of depression, negative outcomes in your body like heart disease, things like that. So there is a stress response that we have in the body. This was proposed by a researcher named Selye. So he called stage 1 the alarm reaction. That is kind of that fight or flight response that maybe you're familiar with. It is an activation of our sympathetic nervous system. So particularly the adrenal medulla releases the substances epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is going to increase our heart rate and increase our blood pressure and our breathing, things like that. What is also going to happen is our hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, and that is going to cause a cascade of the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, amongst other things. And it is going to trigger our body to release our energy storages. So, hey, something's wrong, something's going on. Okay, the adrenal medulla, you need to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. We're feeling stressed. Heart rate's up. Breathing is up. Our body's releasing cortisol. We're releasing our energy storages because our body thinks that we need those because we're going to be in some sort of trouble. We're going to need to maybe run away from someone, again, fight or flight, or approach something. So this is this is what the kind of alarm reaction looks like in every single person. Stress, regardless of what kind of stress that it is, whether it's emotional stress, whether it's literal, physical, you're in front of something, stressed, maybe scared. This is the response that is going to happen in your body. So that is why, again, we say that getting stressed, especially getting stressed frequently and dealing with stress for these long periods of time is not good for us because it is going to be activating this pattern in our body. And it's not good for our body to be secreting cortisol for long periods of time or releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is basically like adrenaline. So here's kind of another little picture. This is from your book. So in response to stress, and again, any type of stress, your body does not decipher between emotional stress or right in front of you physical stress. Hypothalamus is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system to kind of turn on many physiological systems. The adrenal medulla is going to release hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. The hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release other hormones. And it's going to help signal the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, which as you can see right here, so here's the anterior pituitary. It's going to stimulate right here in the adrenals to produce cortisol. And then all of these hormones are going to prepare the rest of your body for action, help us release our energy storages. So that was stage one. That's like kind of our initial reaction to stress, that alarm reaction. Stage two is the adaptation stage. So our body definitely does get to a point where after all of these systems have been activated, your body can still maintain homeostasis while all of this like crazy stuff is going on, and your body can adjust to the stress that you are experiencing. It's able to meet the demands that you're facing. However, what can happen is you can't be in that adaptation stage for too long. So our body has a limit in which it can adapt to stress. It gets to a point where we can fall into the exhaustion stage. This is, again, when we have prolonged stress. So even like micro stressors for really long periods of time are going to be detrimental to us. It's really just like an interplay of demands versus resources. So your body has a set amount of resources, and yes, it can produce certain things, but it gets to a point where it gets kind of depleted. And when it has constant demands over and over and over again, so demands would be the stress, and you're depleting your resources, you can no longer meet those demands and you start to get exhausted. Your body is like, I need rest, I need replenishment, I need to recharge my resources. Like, I'm done, I'm tapped out. And this is really what we talk about when we're referring to the really bad parts of stress. It's people who get into this exhaustion stage of stress. So here is a picture of what this kind of looks like. So we have homeostasis, okay, we have someone who's like good, healthy, they're able to maintain homeostasis. You have this kind of alarm stage where you're like, okay, what's going on? I have like my sympathetic nervous system is responding. I am facing a stressor. You reach a resistance stage where you're like, all right, I can meet the challenges of this stress. It's gonna, propel me to get this done or to meet this challenge or to complete this task. Your body adjusts. But then what starts to happen is you can only maintain this for so long, and then you can get into the exhaustion stage. It can induce feelings of panic, burnout. Clinical burnout is actually a term now. Burnout is something that can actually be diagnosed, which is crazy, and that can just show you the cultural shift too. So the way that we define things and the way that we define certain mental disorders changes over time based off of what's happening culturally. So even the fact that we can clinically, what was the word that I just used? Diagnose. Thank you. Clinically diagnose someone with burnout suggests that there is definitely something going on in our culture, this like fast-paced way of life that is not good for us. We're so constantly connected. We're always on our laptops, and we have our phones, and we have social media, and we have like our families and our jobs, and we're constantly being pulled in all of these different directions. And we are expected to be like the world's greatest multitaskers with all of these different things, maintaining certain online presences, being great at our jobs, being a good family member, carrying all these hats. And a lot of people can get into this exhaustion stage. It's very easy to get into the exhaustion stage when you are a college student. I definitely had times during grad school where like I just totally lost my mind and I like had a couple of panic attacks, and it's not good. It's not good for you to get to the exhaustion stage. So we're also going to talk about some ways in which we can combat stress. But first, we're just going to go over a couple last bits about stress. So we can have kind of good and bad parts of stress. We can have or we can experience what is known as stress immunization. So stress immunization is about early stressors in our life helping to immunize us against bad stress in adulthood. So again, like I already said, early stressors can help protect against some forms of adulthood stress or help us cope with them better. So an example is there was a study done about handling rat pups, so really, really baby rats. Rat pups do experience a lot of stress when they're handled by humans. So we can see those like reactions, physiological patterns. They show signs of distress. We can look at it biologically. So they experience stress when humans pick them up. But if they are comforted or handled briefly right after, they are going to react better to stressors later. We see that they secrete less adrenal steroids even later in life if this is done. So again, this is when they are comforted immediately after they are handled. We see that they have become more resilient or immunized against stress if they have experienced this comfort. However, what can also happen with stress is that it suppresses our immune system. I talked about this earlier on the bad parts of stress. So some stress might be good. Some stress even early in life might be good for helping us cope with things later. However, a bad part of stress is that it can suppress our immune system. And stress triggers the release of cortisol and other adrenal steroids. We looked at the picture that was in your book about kind of physiologically what happens. And what cortisol and these adrenal steroids do in your body is they suppress your immune system. There are certain cells in your body called cytokines. The big cytokine that is mostly talked about is called interleukin 6 or IL-6. You guys don't need to know that. It's just kind of for your general knowledge. And cortisol and adrenal steroids kind of stop these cytokines from being able to do their jobs, which is defend our body against pathogens, make sure that we don't get sick, and support us, right? That's what your immune system does. For example, an example of how stress can support our immune system and how that kind of plays a factor into how we are able to live our lives and live healthy. Caretakers are known as some of the most stressed people. It's like one of the most stressed professions that you can go into is caretaking for another individual. So my hat's off to those of you who maybe have to caretake for an elderly parent or a grandparent or someone who's sick at home, people with family members who have cancer who are helping out at home. Caretakers have the most stressful jobs of really anyone. We've looked at them even compared to like high status, like business, financial CEO types, and caretakers are the most stressed. And we can tell that by even biologically, like how much cortisol their body secretes, things like that. So there was a study done on caretakers and wound healing. So they took this group of caretakers who care for people with all kinds of different ailments. So people who are elderly, people who have cancer, a bunch of different types of caretakers. And what they did is that they administered these like punch wounds to them. So it looks like this little like pen that kind of does a little like hole punch kind of wound. And they did it on a few different spots on their arm. And what we saw is that the caretakers compared to a control group, and the control group were not in caretaking professions, the caretakers' wounds took significantly longer healing time by like days, multiple days. So they would take pictures of these wounds every single day. They'd have people come into the lab, they'd take the pictures, and their body, because of the stress that they were under, their body's immune system, because our immune system definitely helps us with recovering our body and healing from injuries and things like that, that their bodies, because their resources were being depleted from the stress that they were under, couldn't meet the demands of healing those wounds. So why would this be adaptive for us? Why would it be important to kind of stress first and heal later? Some evolutionary psychologists suggest that, back in the wild, if something was harmed, it was not maybe in the best situation to immediately just be able to heal itself. It had to worry about, okay, let me get to a place that's safe. I need to go here. I need to do this. Let me get to an area of cover before I am able to heal myself. But there's a lot of different theories about why our body does this, why our immune system gets so depressed when we experience stress. But the fact of the matter is that stress definitely does depress our immune system. So it's very important to, when you are experiencing high levels of stress, to try and take care of yourself. And we're going to talk about a few different ways in which you can help combat stress. So in your book, it talks about mindfulness-based stress reduction. And some people might think mindfulness is kind of like, okay, yeah, whatever. I just like sit there and I close my eyes and I do some deep breathing. Like, how does that really help? But true mindfulness, when you really practice it as you are supposed to, this is a huge area of research right now, has actually been seen to decrease amygdala activity. And as we all know, that is very much related in our emotional processing, and it's definitely related in feeling negative emotions, which can be linked with stress. So it has a variety of there's a lot of research on this. If you're interested in looking at this, you can Google mindfulness-based stress reduction research and pull up a few different things. There are a couple of apps that are awesome at this. I actually just started using Headspace a few months ago. I really need to be good about doing it every day, but I swear the nights when I do use it, I sleep really, really well. I should have been doing it this entire quarantine because I have been sleeping terribly. But you can choose like how long. You can do it as short as like 5 minutes. You can build yourself up to doing like a full half an hour, whatever you have time for. People, I don't have it on this slide, people who also do mindfulness, practice mindfulness and practice things like meditation, are also associated with better attention, better grades in school, just overall like a lot of different positive things in their lives, better relationships with people. So there's really been no negative thing that has come from looking at things like mindfulness, practicing mindfulness and meditation. Another app is Calm. There's also progressive muscle relaxation. Headspace also, from someone who has used it, myself. Headspace does this where when you lay down or even when you're just kind of sitting around, you hold stress in your body. And without even knowing it, you could be clenching your jaw, or your like arms could be tensed up. Your shoulders can hold a lot of stress. So taking a second to be very aware of your body and just taking a deep breath and like slowly but surely kind of relaxing one muscle at a time, that can really help with reducing your feelings of stress. Exercise. So exercise itself is actually a form of stress. Exercise is putting stress on your body. It's something that raises your heart rate. But exercise produces endorphins, which are very good for your body. And it doesn't even mean that you have to do like hardcore exercise, like a P90X video or anything like that. Even like going for a walk, just like getting your cardiovascular system moving. It could be, especially right now, we're all inside so much. If you are in a position where you're able to go outside, even if it's for like a 10-minute walk around the block, that is very, very good for helping combat stress. Making time for leisure in your life has been empirically shown, or shown in research, that's what empirically means, shown in research to help people combat stress. There are companies who have, which is awesome, given people more vacation days for work, more leave time, where they can work from home one day a week, things like that. And what they find is that their employees are a lot happier. And these employees also report feeling lower levels of stress. So no matter kind of what stage you're at in your life, even if you have like so much going on, maybe you don't have time to take like a full trip, but making time for things that you like to do. Maybe that's like drawing, doing like watercolor. Maybe that's like becoming a plant parent. Maybe that's watching like one of your favorite shows. Maybe that's cooking. Maybe it's watching your favorite show and cooking at the same time. Making time to do things that you like to do are very important for helping you combat stress. There have also been a lot of studies. Again, these are all things that have been backed by research, because I'm never going to tell you to do something that hasn't been proven at least a few times in research. Expressing gratitude is huge for combating stress. They have found that people, there was a study that even I learned in my positive psych class while I was in Santa Barbara. There was a study done with this group of, it was either monks, was something like that, where they looked at and there was like a specific group of them, and they all kept daily journals, and there was some of them who lived like into their like late 90s and hundreds, and they were like, why are these people living so long? And what they looked at is that the journals of the people who lived the longest had significantly more discussions of gratitude in their journals. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to journal every day and talk about all the things that you're grateful for, although that definitely is a great way to start your day, whether you just like mentally think about it or you write it down. But even just expressing gratitude to people in your life, saying thank you to people when you're at the grocery store, saying thank you to the loved ones around you in your life, your parents, your friends, telling people you're grateful for them. Expressing gratitude can help induce very positive feelings in us and help us with combating our stress. Social support is a huge one for combating stress as well. It doesn't mean that you have to have a huge social network of 50 friends who you can call, or this like huge, awesome, super great supportive family, because not all of us have that. But having a few people that you can rely on and turn to and be there to support you and be a very true good friend or a really solid family member, having that kind of support can really help you get through stress. So I want to end this lecture with showing you guys this TED Talk on the science of emotions. So I want you to please take notes on the following YouTube video, especially about the emerging research approaches to combating depression.
What would art be like without emotions? It would be empty. What would our lives be like without emotions? They would be empty of values. So a famous classical poet said, "We hate and we love. Can one tell me why?" Catullus. Science does not answer why questions. Science answers how questions. But the why question would be answered as follows. We have feelings because they tell us what supports our survival and what detracts from our survival. And I've been in this field now for half a century, and it's been a fairly lonely field because when I was a student in electrical engineering, I started getting bored, and I worked in the back wards of a psychiatric hospital and saw human tragedies, their emotional tragedies, and no one knew what emotions were, how we get these feelings. So I decided to shift to neuroscience, first clinical psychology, then neuroscience. That is the only path to understanding how we feel. This seems to be an impenetrable mystery, but it is potentially penetrable with neuroscience, especially if we take the emotions of animals seriously. And a friend sent me these pictures. Little fawn was injured, and the dog took a special interest in the fawn. Now, is the dog thinking, or interesting? We cannot penetrate the cognitive mind of animals, even though they're very skilled in living, as we saw earlier this morning. So, second picture, is the dog saying, I like you, or even I love you. We cannot penetrate those kinds of thoughts, but we can penetrate feelings scientifically, but only with neuroscience. And if we understand the emotions of other animals, I think we will begin to understand our own emotions. Artist drew this for me about a year ago, and even chickens have emotions. We mapped out sadness systems in chickens, and they turn out to be the same as in guinea pigs, and it looks like they're very similar to those in human brains. That's quite a shocker. Now, the animal mind is of great interest to us right now, and I suspect that if we really focus on their feelings, we will finally begin to understand our own. So our approach requires neuroscience, and we can actually turn on emotions by stimulating specific areas of the brain. We've known this for quite a while, but I was among the first to ask, when we turn on an emotion, does the animal feel good or bad? The animal can give us that answer because it can turn on this stimulation, give them a chance, or it can turn it off. And that is our measure of feelings. So we're very similar at the bottom of our minds, and we're very, very different at the top of our minds. We are the cognitive creatures. They are the emotional creatures, but they obviously must have thoughts about their lives and the world. So this is a powerful emotion. We get angry and we get scared because of very similar systems in our brain. And it turns out that wherever you produce this anger response in animals, they turn it off. They don't like the feeling. So there is something like anger in the animal brain. And if we understand those circuits, we might have new treatments for, irritability disorders. Someone is continually getting angry and you say, take a pill. Well, we have no pill. But we do have knowledge about 7 basic emotional systems. We call them primary emotions. We capitalize them because this requires a specialized terminology for science. Otherwise, we have confusing conversations because of so many words. So what feeling does the seeking system, others still call it the reward system? The feeling is not pleasure. The feeling is enthusiasm. This is diminished in depression, and I'll show you one clinical trial we're running where we're facilitating enthusiasm directly through deep brain stimulation. That's the feeling in the vernacular. I'm using everyday terms here, of course, and there are many sources of anxiety in the world, but we only have one powerful fear system. And what shall we call the feeling of lust? Well, I thought of passion, but that is too broad a term. Now, care is tender and loving. It's hard to describe these pre-verbal powers of the mind. The panic system generates loneliness and sadness, and like I told you, in chickens we measure separation calls. So play brings you great joy. If you have too much psychological pain, namely the panic system, probably causes panic attacks also. This is the gateway to depression, too much psychological pain. If it's way beyond bounds, people begin to think about killing themselves. So we have developed one antidepressant by focusing on the molecular biology of happiness and joy, and it is currently in human testing. Yes, that is the way tender, loving feelings feel in the mind. It has a certain dynamic. It comes across in the body, the way the mother caresses the child. And a child that doesn't have that will have psychological problems for the rest of his or her life. So, if we understand these emotional systems, some of them will be rewarding, some are punishing, but they're never neutral. And that is the evidence that they have emotional feelings. And we can predict that if we stimulate the rage system in humans, they will be very angry, and that has been shown just accidentally during surgical procedures. So, let's focus on this panic system that we started to study 45 years ago. When you separate a young one from the mother, they begin to cry because the mother is the absolute source of security. And we started measuring this crying and trying to figure out the neuroanatomy of it and the neurochemistries, and that has led to new treatments for depression as well as for suicide. If you take a little bird, and they're born, and they're walking around, and they're crying, looking for their mother, and as soon as they find the mother's wings, they settle down, and they're comfortable. And we can stimulate this by simply holding the little ones in our hands. They immediately quiet down, they feel comfortable, their beat goes down, and they fall asleep. This is because we're activating chemicals that counteract psychological pain. And the most powerful chemistry for this turns out to be brain opioids. That's a shocker. It turns out that our love and our attachment are partially addictive phenomena. They ride upon our internal opioids. They provide us with a sense of security, that everything is right in the world. So there we are. That is the reason we become addicted to these molecules. And it's a tragedy of our country that we put people in jail as opposed to putting them in treatment facilities to explain what's happening in their brains. I think it would be wonderful if our government had an open conversation about the sources of addiction in our brain. Opioids mediate motherly love, the attachment bond between mother and child, the attachment bond between loving adults. And then we found that the molecule that releases milk from the breast also is very powerful in the brain in reducing the panic response, the separation distress response. And lo and behold, the molecule that manufactures milk in the breast is equally effective in reducing separation distress. So the physiology of motherhood is the physiology of love. And we mapped this system with deep brain stimulation in guinea pigs first, and then chickens, and the anatomy was the same, and the neurochemistries were the same. And you see that in the guinea pig picture, a deep subcortical system where you can activate these separation cries. And even if you take an adult guinea pig that no longer cries, if you put an electrode in there, they will cry like a little baby as long as you provide the stimulation. So where does it go? It kind of develops inhibition from higher brain areas. Testosterone is something that counteracts crying. That's why there's a large difference in male and female emotions. Antonio Damasio imaged emotional feelings for the first time and found a very similar trajectory. And then Jan-Kar Subieta at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, found that human depression and sadness were low opioids in these same brain areas. Remarkable. We are brothers and sisters under the skin with all the other animals, which provides us with a special responsibility for how we treat them in this world of ours. the wonderful pictures we saw Art share with you. So we have generated 3 new concepts. The first one is to use safe opioids not only to treat depression, and buprenorphine is a safe opioid because you can't kill yourself with it. Respiratory depression does not get so extreme because it begins to block its own action at higher doses. And this could be used for depression for the last 30 years, but we don't have a culture that permits this. And we're testing this as an anti-suicide agent in Israel. So we're using the Beck suicide inventory in people that are thinking about taking their lives. During the first week, in these 4 individuals, all 4 showed benefits from both placebo and buprenorphine. Now, placebos release opioids in the brain, but by the second week, the placebo was no longer effective, but buprenorphine still was. This led us to test 60 people, double-blind, placebo-controlled, and that trial will be finished by Christmas. And it will work, I am confident. The second concept has been to use deep brain stimulation to restore enthusiasm for life. And this cannot be easily done in America. I did convince colleagues in Europe who are doing deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease to move their electrodes slightly into the seeking system, because we know from animal work, if you overstimulate the separation panic system, it decreases the enthusiasm for life, as this attempts to summarize. And if you could elevate the seeking mood directly, the enthusiasm mood, it should have antidepressant effects. And lo and behold, they published this paper about in the middle of July. 6 of 7 depressed people that had not gotten any benefits from anything, including electroconvulsive shock, showed dramatic elevations in the desire to live and enthusiasm to do things in the world. They were basically normalized by facilitating the seeking system. And finally, we have been using play as a model for identifying new molecules for antidepressants. What would be better than some molecular pathway to facilitate social joy? The only thing better is to live in the human family happily with art, culture, music, all of the fine things in life. Of course, human relationships are the best antidepressants. But we have joy systems in the brain, and we can figure out the molecules, and we have done that with my Northwestern colleagues. And we have developed a new antidepressant that came from the analysis of cortical changes in gene expression patterns and checking out the candidates as possible antidepressants. And the first couple were antidepressants, but they also had medical dangers. But we found one that didn't have any of these problems. By analyzing a rat's playing, purely positively, I've gotten the famous name of the rat tickler. So we have listened to animals playing. It's from 1998. What appeared to be the sounds of laughter. And we studied these for a couple of years without quite understanding that this might be laughter. And then one day we decided to tickle some animals. You can't hear this. And we realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained these transducers that are called bat detectors that can bring very high frequencies down to our auditory range. And when we did this and we listened in, we could tickle animals and generate a lot of vocal activity that appeared to be laughter. These animals would begin to enjoy our company, and they would start to play with our hands, and wherever we would put our hands, they would follow it. And when we tested these animals to ask whether they were enjoying this kind of activity, the unambiguous answer was yes. I might share that the day before that was filmed by the BBC, our first publication in that area, they told me I had no more than a year to live no matter what. So glad to be here with you. If we finally take the emotions of the other animals seriously, we will finally understand how we have these feelings of joy and sorrow, anger and sadness. Essentially, this molecule is called GLIX13. It's a very long story that I don't have time to share with you here, but it is already in phase 2 FDA-approved human testing. Single injection produced antidepressant effects immediately, and those effects from the one treatment lasted a week. No psychiatric medicine has yet been developed by human knowledge. So far, everything has been discovered by serendipity and chance. Science has only refined the molecules. This may be the first psychiatric medicine to come from human knowledge by taking animal feelings seriously. And this has no poisonous properties as far as we can tell. It's also not addictive. So finally, this is the conclusion of a 50-year-old journey. And I do hope that people take a very different attitude to animals than has been common in research and a variety of other human activities. We are brothers and sisters under the skin, and we better recognize that. And once we understand them, we will finally understand ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, so on that note, this concludes our lecture on emotion, stress, and aggression. I hope that you all enjoyed that YouTube video. I know this lecture was a little bit long, but all really important, really interesting information. Remember to know particularly the emerging research approaches to combating depression. So he discussed 3 of them. I definitely want you guys to know about those. And in general, I just wanted to show you that video because I just thought it was really interesting and definitely very related to this chapter and what we are learning about. As usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email.